My wife called me into her office with a smug smile that should have warned me. The corner suite at Morrison & Associates gleamed with polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Cleveland. Rachel sat behind her executive desk like a queen holding court, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late afternoon hour. "Congratulations, Jamie," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm promoting my boyfriend Steve instead of you." Steve Carver lounged in the leather chair beside her desk, his athletic frame stretched out casually. He flashed that perfect smile that had charmed half the company. "Nothing personal, Jamie. I just understand team play better." 5 years of 60-hour weeks flashed through my mind. 5 years of building the compliance department from nothing. 5 years of watching Rachel climb the corporate ladder while I handled the grunt work that kept Morrison & Associates from regulatory trouble. I nodded calmly and reached into my briefcase. "I understand completely." Rachel's confidence radiated across the room. She probably expected tears or anger, maybe a desperate plea for reconsideration. Instead, I pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it on her desk. "Here's my resignation letter," I said. She opened it casually, still wearing that triumphant smile. Then her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks as she stared at the contents. Inside were 18 photographs of Rachel and Steve in various hotel rooms over the past year and a half. The Marriott downtown, the Hilton by the airport, the boutique place on the east side where they thought nobody would recognize them. Every single trip expensed to company shareholders as client development meetings. "What is this?" Rachel's voice cracked slightly. "Just the beginning," I replied. Steve leaned forward, trying to see the photos. His cocky expression melted when he recognized himself. "Where did you get these?" I smiled for the first time in months. "I'm not just your average middle manager, Steve. I spent 12 years as a compliance officer for the Securities and Exchange Commission before Rachel recruited me here. Old habits never fade." Rachel's hands shook as she flipped through the evidence. Hotel receipts with forged signatures, credit card statements showing personal purchases on company accounts, email chains discussing their relationship while planning business strategy around their romantic getaways. "You can't use these," she stammered. "This is an invasion of privacy." Actually, it's not. Every photo was taken in public spaces. Every document came through proper legal channels. I learned a lot about evidence collection in my previous career. The manila envelope contained much more than photographs. Falsified quarterly reports with Rachel's electronic signature. Marketing budgets redirected to shell companies owned by Steve's family members. Ghost employees on the payroll. His brother-in-law who lived in Florida and had never set foot in Ohio. His cousin who supposedly worked in remote consulting while running a surf shop in California. $3.2 million in documented fraud over 4 years. Steve jumped to his feet. "You're bluffing. You don't have anything real." I pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Rachel's voice filled the office, crystal clear from last month's strategy meeting. "The shareholders are idiots, Steve. They'll approve anything if we massage the numbers right. These compliance reports are just paperwork nobody actually reads." Steve's voice followed. "Your husband doesn't suspect anything, does he? About the money or us?" Rachel's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Jamie's too boring to notice. He just does what I tell him and collects his paycheck. Perfect cover for everything we've built here." I clicked off the recorder. Ohio is a one-party consent state. I can legally record any conversation I'm part of. Amazing what people say when they think compliance officers are just paper pushers. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and went pale. "That's probably the board requesting your presence at an emergency meeting," I said. "I filed a formal complaint an hour ago. As a company shareholder, I own 500 shares purchased over the past 2 years. I'm entitled to present evidence of executive misconduct." "You're a shareholder?" Steve's voice climbed an octave. "Bought shares every month with my bonus money." Rachel always wondered why I never spent those bonuses on anything fun. Turns out they were the best investment I ever made. Rachel stood shakily. "Jamie, we can work this out. Whatever you want. I want justice. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. You might want to bring a lawyer." The Morrison & Associates boardroom felt like a courtroom as I arranged my evidence on the polished conference table. 12 directors filed in, their faces ranging from curious to concerned. Rachel entered last, flanked by Steve and Maya Chen from Human Resources. Her usual confidence had cracked, replaced by the desperate composure of someone trying to control a rapidly deteriorating situation. Board Chairman William Morrison, the company founder's son, called the meeting to order. "Mr. Lane, you've requested this emergency session. Please present your concerns." I connected my laptop to the projection system. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 4 years, this company has been systematically defrauded by members of its senior executive team. I have documented evidence of securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The first slide showed a timeline of suspicious transactions. Rachel shifted uncomfortably as her signature appeared on document after document authorizing questionable expenditures. "Mrs. Lane, as Vice President of Operations, has created a network of shell vendors and ghost employees to siphon company funds. Her co-conspirator, Steve Carver, has used his position in business development to facilitate these schemes." Steve started to stand. "This is ridiculous. Jamie's obviously—" "Mr. Carver, please remain seated," Morrison said firmly. "Continue, Mr. Lane." I clicked to the next slide showing bank records. Carver Marketing Solutions received $400,000 in consulting fees over 2 years. The company is owned by Steve's brother-in-law in Tampa, who has no marketing experience. His background is in landscaping. Director Patricia Walsh leaned forward. "Do we have documentation of work performed?" "None whatsoever. The invoices are generic, no deliverables, no project descriptions, no measurable outcomes. The payments coincide exactly with Rachel and Steve's hotel stays, suggesting the money funded their personal relationship." Rachel's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. She shook her head stubbornly. I advanced to financial records showing the ghost payroll scheme. 14 employees exist only on paper. They receive paychecks but never report to work. Background checks reveal they're family members and friends of Steve Carver, scattered across multiple states. The room grew quiet except for the hum of the projector. Director James Patterson examined printed copies of the evidence. "These payroll records show consistent patterns over years. How did our auditors miss this?" "The external auditors only see summary reports." Rachel controlled which detailed records they reviewed. "She's been very careful to limit access to information that would expose the fraud." Maya Chen spoke for the first time. "Mr. Lane, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof of intent to defraud rather than administrative errors?" I played the audio recording. Rachel's voice filled the boardroom, discussing money manipulation and shareholder deception. When her recorded laugh about my supposed ignorance echoed through the speakers, several directors exchanged glances. Steve tried again to leave. Director Morrison nodded to building security, who quietly blocked the exits. "There's more," I continued. "Rachel has been using company credit cards for personal expenses, then categorizing them as business costs. Jewelry, spa treatments, weekend trips unrelated to company business. The total exceeds $60,000 over 3 years. I displayed credit card statements with highlighted personal charges. Expensive restaurants where no clients were present, shopping sprees at luxury stores, hotel rooms booked for personal vacations, but expensed as business travel." Rachel finally spoke. "Jamie, you're taking things out of context. Those expenses were legitimate business, including the $5,000 necklace you bought for Steve's birthday, categorized as client appreciation gifts, despite no client receiving it." Her face flushed red. Steve stared at his hands. Director Walsh reviewed the financial summaries. "Mr. Lane, what's the total estimated loss to the company?" $3.2 million in direct theft. Additional losses from missed opportunities and regulatory risks are harder to quantify but potentially much larger." Morrison stood slowly. "Mrs. Lane, Mr. Carver, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building. All company property, including credit cards, phones, and access badges, must be surrendered now." Rachel's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this. I built this department. I made this company profitable." "You made yourself profitable at our expense," Morrison replied coldly. "Lane, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll be referring this matter to federal authorities immediately." As security led Rachel and Steve toward the door, she turned back to me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, Jamie. You have no idea what you've started." I watched them disappear down the hallway. "Actually, Rachel, I know exactly what I've started. And I know exactly how it ends." The FBI field office in downtown Cleveland felt like stepping into a different world. Agent Patricia Rodriguez led me through corridors lined with wanted posters and federal agency seals. Her partner, Agent Michael Torres, waited in a sterile conference room with recording equipment and stacks of legal documents. Mr. Lane, your complaint has initiated a federal investigation into securities fraud and wire fraud, Agent Rodriguez explained. We need to walk through your evidence systematically. I spread out 4 years of documentation across the conference table. Bank records, email chains, audio recordings, financial statements, and travel receipts formed a comprehensive map of Rachel and Steve's criminal enterprise. The pattern began almost immediately after I joined Morrison and Associates, I began. Rachel hired me specifically because of my SEC background. She wanted someone who understood compliance regulations, but wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about executive decisions. Agent Torres examined the shell company records. How did you first become suspicious? Monthly financial reviews showed consistent anomalies. Payments to vendors I'd never heard of, employees who never attended meetings or responded to emails, expense reports that didn't match actual business activities. My SEC training taught me to recognize these patterns. The agent spent 3 hours reviewing evidence. Agent Rodriguez focused on the wire fraud elements, electronic transfers to fake companies and fraudulent expense reimbursements. Agent Torres concentrated on securities fraud, false financial reports provided to shareholders and potential investors. Your documentation is extremely thorough, Rodriguez noted. Most whistleblower complaints require months of additional investigation. You've essentially built our case for us. I pulled out a timeline chart showing the escalation of criminal activity. Rachel got bolder over time. The first year, fraudulent transactions totaled maybe 50,000. By year 4, they were stealing over $1 million annually. Torres studied the ghost payroll records. 14 fake employees across 6 states. That suggests sophisticated planning and coordination. This wasn't impulsive, it was systematic. Steve recruited family members and friends to receive paychecks for non-existent work. His brother-in-law in Florida, his college roommate in Texas, his cousin in California. They probably kept a percentage and sent the rest back through cash transactions or cryptocurrency. Agent Rodriguez made notes about potential co-conspirators. We'll need to interview these individuals to determine their level of involvement and cooperation. The audio recordings provided the strongest evidence of intent. Rachel's voice clearly discussing financial manipulation and shareholder deception established criminal mindset beyond reasonable doubt. How many recordings do you have? Torres asked. 47 conversations over 18 months. I started recording after noticing suspicious patterns in financial reports. Every meeting where fraud was discussed, every conversation about hiding information from auditors, every planning session for fake business trips. Rodriguez reviewed the hotel and travel records. They were using company funds for personal romantic getaways while claiming business purposes. That's textbook embezzlement. The hotel receipts show room service charges for expensive champagne and spa treatments, not typical business meeting expenses. Credit card records reveal jewelry purchases, personal shopping, and restaurant bills for 2 people during supposed solo business trips. Agent Torres outlined the next steps. We'll execute search warrants for Rachel and Steve's personal and business records, bank accounts, computer files, phone records, additional financial documents. Your evidence provides probable cause for comprehensive investigation. What about the other conspirators? I asked. Maya Chen from HR appears to have facilitated some fraudulent transactions. We'll determine her level of involvement and potential cooperation. The ghost employees will face charges related to conspiracy and money laundering. Rodriguez explained the federal prosecution timeline. Grand jury proceedings typically take 3 to 6 months. If indictments are returned, trial preparation requires additional time. You'll be our primary witness. I'm prepared to testify. This fraud damaged every honest employee at Morrison and Associates and cheated shareholders out of millions. Torres handed me whistleblower protection documents. Federal law protects you from retaliation. Any attempts to intimidate or harm you become additional federal charges. As we concluded the meeting, Agent Rodriguez shook my hand. Mr. Lane, your evidence and cooperation will likely result in successful prosecutions. The Department of Justice takes financial crimes very seriously, especially when they involve securities fraud. Walking out of the federal building, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Rachel and Steve had no idea how thoroughly their criminal enterprise was documented or how seriously federal prosecutors would pursue their case. The investigation was just beginning, but the outcome was already certain. Steve Carver's attorney delivered the cooperation agreement to federal prosecutors exactly 48 hours after the FBI raided his apartment. I learned this from Agent Rodriguez during our follow-up meeting at the federal building. Mr. Carver has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, she explained. He's providing details about the conspiracy we couldn't have discovered through financial records alone. The cooperation agreement revealed the true scope of Rachel's criminal enterprise. Steve's testimony documented additional fraudulent schemes I hadn't uncovered during my investigation. Fake consulting contracts with companies that existed only on paper. Kickback arrangements with legitimate vendors who inflated invoices and shared the excess with Rachel. Investment fraud involving company pension funds diverted to high-risk ventures that benefited Rachel personally. The total fraud amount has increased to over $5 million, Agent Torres informed me. Your initial investigation captured the obvious crimes. Steve's cooperation is revealing sophisticated financial manipulation. Rachel's response to Steve's betrayal was predictable and self-destructive. Rather than accepting a plea agreement, she hired expensive criminal defense attorneys and prepared to fight every charge. Her lawyer held a press conference claiming prosecutorial overreach and suggesting the evidence was fabricated by a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Mrs. Lane believes she can convince a jury that this is a domestic dispute rather than criminal fraud, Rodriguez explained. Her attorneys are planning to portray you as a jealous husband manufacturing evidence. I reviewed Steve's cooperation statement, which detailed conversations where Rachel explicitly discussed hiding criminal activity from auditors and regulators. His testimony would corroborate my recordings and provide additional evidence of criminal intent. How strong is the case without Steve's cooperation, I asked. Torres smiled grimly. Your evidence alone would support conviction. Steve's testimony just makes it overwhelming. Rachel's decision to go to trial is essentially choosing a longer sentence. The grand jury proceedings moved quickly. Federal prosecutors presented evidence systematically, building from basic fraud to complex conspiracy charges. Steve testified for 6 hours, over 2 days, describing the criminal enterprise in detail. Rachel's attempts to intimidate potential witnesses backfired spectacularly. She contacted several Morrison & Associates employees, trying to convince them I had manipulated evidence or acted vindictively. These conversations, recorded by suspicious employees and turned over to federal agents, became additional charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Your former wife is making our case stronger every day, Rodriguez observed. Each attempt to interfere with the investigation adds years to her potential sentence. The indictment included 12 counts of securities fraud, 8 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of money laundering, and 4 counts of conspiracy. Additional charges for witness tampering and obstruction brought the total to over 30 federal felonies. Maya Chen accepted a plea agreement after her attorney reviewed the evidence against her. Her cooperation revealed Rachel's manipulation of HR records to hide the ghost employee scheme and her assistance in creating false documentation for fraudulent expense reports. Chen's testimony will establish Rachel's leadership role in the conspiracy, Torres explained. She can describe meetings where Rachel gave specific instructions for covering up criminal activity. Steve's family members across multiple states were indicted for their roles in the ghost payroll scheme. Most accepted plea agreements and agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Their testimony would demonstrate the scope and coordination required for Rachel's criminal enterprise. The evidence is overwhelming, Rodriguez summarized. Financial records, audio recordings, witness testimony, and documentary evidence all support the same conclusion. Rachel Lane orchestrated a sophisticated fraud scheme over multiple years. As the trial date approached, Rachel's attorneys made increasingly desperate motions to suppress evidence or dismiss charges. Every motion was denied. Federal judges don't tolerate financial fraud, especially when it involves securities violations and investor deception. She's going to trial with no viable defense strategy, Torres observed. Her attorneys know the evidence is overwhelming, but she's refusing to accept responsibility. I prepared for my testimony by reviewing 4 years of evidence collection. Every document, every recording, every financial transaction that established Rachel's guilt. The case that began with suspicious expense reports had evolved into one of the largest corporate fraud prosecutions in Ohio's recent history. The trial would be Rachel's final opportunity to accept responsibility for her crimes. Her decision to fight the charges would determine whether she received a moderate sentence or faced decades in federal prison. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as United States v. Rachel Lane began. Media attention had intensified after prosecutors released details about the $5 million fraud scheme. Local business publications covered the case extensively, focusing on how a compliance officer's investigation exposed years of systematic theft. Rachel entered the courtroom wearing an expensive navy suit, flanked by two high-priced defense attorneys. Her confident demeanor suggested she still believed she could convince the jury of her innocence. Steve sat in the witness section, looking nervous and avoiding eye contact with his former partner in crime. Jury selection took 2 days. Federal prosecutors sought jurors who understood business concepts but wouldn't be sympathetic to white-collar criminals. Defense attorneys tried to find jurors who might view the case as a domestic dispute rather than serious fraud. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh delivered the opening statement with precision and clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed, betrayal, and the systematic theft of over $5 million from shareholders and employees who trusted the defendant with their financial security. She outlined the evidence methodically. Financial records showing fraudulent transactions, audio recordings capturing criminal planning, witness testimony describing the defendant's leadership role in the conspiracy, documentary evidence establishing intent to defraud investors and regulators. Rachel's defense attorney, Thomas Morrison, attempted to shift blame to Steve and portray Rachel as a victim of manipulation. My client made poor personal choices, but she never intended to commit fraud. She trusted Steve Carver, who exploited her emotionally and professionally. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days. FBI agents testified about the investigation and evidence collection. Forensic accountants explained the financial fraud schemes. Morrison and Associates executives described how Rachel's crimes damaged the company's reputation and financial stability. My testimony lasted 2 full days. Prosecutor Walsh walked me through the evidence discovery process, from initial suspicions to comprehensive documentation of criminal activity. The jury listened intently as I explained how compliance training helped me recognize fraud patterns. Mr. Lane, why did you continue collecting evidence for 4 years instead of reporting suspicious activity immediately? Walsh asked. I needed comprehensive proof of systematic fraud rather than isolated incidents. Rachel was sophisticated in hiding criminal activity. Individual transactions might seem questionable, but the pattern over time clearly established criminal intent. Defense attorney Morrison's cross-examination attempted to portray me as vindictive and obsessed with revenge. Isn't it true, Mr. Lane, that you discovered your wife's affair and decided to destroy her career? I discovered criminal activity that happened to involve my wife. The evidence speaks for itself regardless of personal relationships. Morrison pressed harder. You recorded private conversations without her knowledge. You investigated her personal activities. This seems like stalking behavior, not legitimate compliance work. I recorded business meetings where criminal activity was discussed. I documented financial transactions using company records. Everything I collected was legally obtained and directly related to fraud schemes. The audio recordings proved devastating to Rachel's defense, her voice clearly discussing financial manipulation, shareholder deception, and regulatory evasion eliminated any possibility of claiming innocent mistakes. The jury heard her laughing about my supposed ignorance while planning additional crimes. Steve's testimony provided insider details about the criminal conspiracy. He described meetings where Rachel planned fraudulent schemes, conversations about hiding evidence from auditors, and discussions about expanding criminal activity to other areas of the company. Rachel was always the leader, Steve testified. She planned everything, made the key decisions, and told me exactly how to implement her schemes. I followed her instructions because I trusted her judgment. Maya Chen's testimony corroborated Steve's account. She described Rachel's specific instructions for creating false HR records, manipulating employee files to hide ghost workers, and generating fraudulent documentation for expense reports. Mrs. Lane told me the ghost employees were a temporary measure to handle budget fluctuations, Chen testified. She said the auditors wouldn't examine individual payroll records if the summary numbers looked reasonable. Rachel's decision to testify in her own defense proved catastrophic. Under direct examination, she attempted to blame Steve for manipulating her into criminal activity. She claimed ignorance about financial regulations and suggested her actions were misguided rather than criminal. Prosecutor Walsh's cross-examination methodically destroyed Rachel's credibility. Using the audio recordings, Walsh demonstrated Rachel's detailed knowledge of fraud schemes and her leadership role in planning criminal activity. And Mrs. Lane, in this recording from March 15th, you're heard saying, "The shareholders are idiots who will approve anything if we massage the numbers right." Do you remember making that statement? Rachel's composure cracked. That was taken out of context. I was frustrated about the context is a planning meeting where you discussed falsifying quarterly reports. Your voice is clearly heard giving specific instructions about manipulating financial data. How is that taken out of context? The recording played in the silent courtroom. Rachel's voice, clear and confident, discussing criminal activity in detail. The jury watched her face as she listened to her own words describing shareholders as targets for deception. Walsh continued relentlessly. You testified that Steve Carver made the key decisions about fraudulent transactions, but this recording from April shows you telling him exactly which fake vendors to create and how much money to transfer. Were you lying then or are you lying now? Rachel's testimony collapsed under the weight of recorded evidence. Every claim of innocence was contradicted by her own voice planning criminal activity. Every attempt to blame Steve was refuted by recordings showing her giving explicit instructions. Closing arguments lasted 4 hours. Prosecutor Walsh summarized the overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud, emphasizing Rachel's leadership role and criminal intent. Defense attorney Morrison made a desperate plea for mercy, suggesting Rachel's crimes resulted from emotional manipulation rather than greed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. When they returned, the foreman announced guilty verdicts on all 32 counts. Rachel's face went white as the verdicts were read. Securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. Each guilty verdict carried years of federal prison time. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Rachel was remanded to federal custody immediately, her bail revoked due to witness tampering convictions. As federal marshals led Rachel away in handcuffs, she looked back at me one final time. The arrogance and contempt were gone, replaced by the reality of spending the next decade in federal prison. Justice had been served, but the satisfaction felt hollow. 4 years of criminal activity had destroyed lives, damaged careers, and stolen millions from innocent people. Rachel's conviction couldn't undo that harm, but it ensured she would face consequences for her choices. The trial was over. The sentencing would determine exactly how severe those consequences would be. 6 weeks later, I returned to the federal courthouse for Rachel's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with Morrison and Associates employees, shareholders, and media representatives. Federal sentencing hearings for major fraud cases typically draw significant attention, and Rachel's case had become a symbol of corporate accountability. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the presentence report, which detailed Rachel's criminal history, financial crimes, and lack of genuine remorse. The probation office recommended a sentence at the high end of federal guidelines, 12 to 15 years in prison. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh presented the government's sentencing memorandum. Your Honor, the defendant orchestrated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that stole over $5 million from shareholders and employees. Her leadership role, extensive planning, and attempts to obstruct justice warrant a significant sentence. Rachel's attorney, Thomas Morrison, made a final plea for leniency. My client accepts responsibility for her actions and deeply regrets the harm caused to Morrison and Associates and its stakeholders. She asked the court to consider her previously clean record and family circumstances. Judge Williams allowed victim impact statements. Several Morrison and Associates employees described how Rachel's crimes affected their retirement savings, career opportunities, and trust in corporate leadership. Shareholders explained financial losses and damaged confidence in the company's management. I chose not to provide a victim impact statement. My role as the whistleblower who exposed Rachel's crimes spoke for itself. The evidence I collected and my testimony at trial were my contribution to achieving justice. Rachel was given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing. She stood slowly, her expensive suit replaced by a standard federal detention uniform. Your Honor, I take full responsibility for my actions and deeply regret the harm I caused to Morrison and Associates, its employees, and shareholders. I made terrible decisions that betrayed the trust placed in me as a corporate executive. Her statement sounded rehearsed and insincere. Throughout the trial, Rachel had blamed Steve, claimed ignorance of financial regulations, and portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation. Her 11th-hour acceptance of responsibility fooled nobody. Judge Williams reviewed the sentencing factors methodically. Mrs. Lane, you held a position of trust and authority within Morrison and Associates. You exploited that position to steal millions through sophisticated fraud schemes. Your crimes were not impulsive mistakes, but calculated theft over multiple years. The judge continued, your attempts to obstruct justice and tamper with witnesses demonstrate a complete lack of respect for the legal system. Even after your arrest, you continued trying to manipulate the investigation and intimidate potential witnesses. Judge Williams announced the sentence. Mrs. Lane, you are hereby sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay restitution of $5.2 million to Morrison and Associates and its shareholders. Rachel's legs buckled slightly as the sentence was announced. 14 years in federal prison meant she would be nearly 55 when released. The restitution order would consume any remaining assets and future earnings for decades. Steve Carver received his sentence the following week. His cooperation with federal prosecutors earned him a reduced term of 6 years in prison. Maya Chen received 18 months for her lesser role in the conspiracy. The ghost employees across multiple states received sentences ranging from probation to 2 years imprisonment. Morrison and Associates offered me the position of Chief Compliance Officer with a significant salary increase and expanded authority over financial oversight. The company wanted to rebuild its reputation by demonstrating commitment to ethical business practices. I accepted the position, but with conditions. Complete independence in conducting compliance investigations. Direct reporting to the board of directors rather than executive management. Authority to hire additional compliance staff and implement comprehensive fraud prevention systems. Mr. Lane, your investigation saved this company from continued criminal activity and potential regulatory sanctions, Chairman Morrison explained. We want to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. The compliance department expanded from my single position to a team of 6 professionals with expertise in financial auditing, regulatory oversight, and fraud detection. We implemented systems to monitor expense reports, vendor payments, and payroll records in real time. Federal prosecutors offered me a whistleblower reward under securities law, 15% of recovered funds, potentially worth over $700,000. The reward recognized my role in exposing securities fraud and protecting investors from continued harm. I used part of the reward to establish a legal defense fund for corporate whistleblowers. Too many employees discover criminal activity but lack resources to pursue proper legal channels. The fund would provide legal support and protection for individuals willing to expose corporate fraud. 6 months after Rachel's sentencing, Morrison and Associates received the Corporate Ethics Award from the Ohio Business Council. The company's transformation from fraud victim to ethics leader demonstrated the importance of strong compliance systems and employee accountability. My consulting practice, specializing in corporate fraud detection and prevention, attracted clients across multiple industries. Companies wanted compliance systems designed by someone who had successfully exposed sophisticated criminal activity and navigated federal prosecution. The first consulting client was Midwest Manufacturing, a company where Rachel had worked before joining Morrison and Associates. Their internal audit had discovered suspicious financial patterns similar to those I had documented in Rachel's case. Mr. Lane, we need someone who understands how executive fraud operates and how to build cases that will stand up in court, their CEO explained. My investigation revealed Rachel had implemented similar schemes during her previous employment. Ghost vendors, fake consulting contracts, and manipulated expense reports had netted her nearly $2 million in additional theft. Federal prosecutors expanded their case to include these earlier crimes. Rachel's sentence increased to 18 years after pleading guilty to additional fraud charges. The pattern of criminal activity across multiple employers demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of financial manipulation and complete disregard for legal and ethical boundaries. Steve served his 6-year sentence at a minimum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. His cooperation with prosecutors and acceptance of responsibility earned him early release after 4.5 years. He relocated to a different state and found employment in construction, his business career permanently destroyed. Maya Chen completed her 18-month sentence and returned to Ohio. Her conviction made employment in human resources impossible, but she found work in nonprofit administration. Her cooperation with federal prosecutors and genuine remorse helped her rebuild her life after prison. Rachel remains in federal custody at a women's facility in West Virginia. Her earliest possible release date is 2039, when she will be 57 years old. The restitution order ensures that any future earnings will be garnished to repay her victims. The investigation that began with suspicious expense reports ultimately exposed over $7 million in corporate fraud across multiple companies and resulted in federal convictions for 12 individuals. The case became a model for how compliance officers can effectively investigate and document sophisticated financial crimes. Morrison and Associates recovered most of the stolen funds through asset forfeiture, insurance claims, and restitution payments. The company's stock price, which fell 20% after the fraud disclosure, recovered completely within 2 years, as investors gained confidence in the new compliance systems. My career transformation from overlooked compliance officer to respected fraud investigator proved that dedication to ethical principles and thorough documentation can overcome even sophisticated criminal enterprises. Rachel's attempt to destroy my career instead launched my success as a corporate ethics expert. The case file sits in my office as a reminder that justice requires patience, preparation, and persistence. Rachel's crimes caused enormous harm, but her prosecution sent a clear message that corporate fraud will be investigated, prosecuted, and punished regardless of the perpetrator's position or connections. 14 years in federal prison was exactly what Rachel's crimes deserved.